perhaps air quality was affecting him, maybe feeling a bit stuffy in that room. Oh, and it was the English opening, and I was expecting you to guess that one, Kaya, and so close. It was something.
He did get it right. There was no e4, d4, or knight f3. He starts with the pawn in front of the bishop and moves it 2 steps ahead, but we might see a conversion there.
Yeah, so a transposition, it started as an English opening. It can transpose into the Queen's Gambit declined, especially if White lifts his Queen's pawn. Now we're back in the Queen's Gambit declined via a different route. And, okay, which variation will Hikaru choose? He's played pretty much everything in this position. He normally keeps it solid, just develops the black bishop 1 square, the black dark square bishop gets castled, and then solves his problems a bit later. But Hikaru looking off to the right now, just choosing, just deciding what to play against Magnus. I'm sure he's predicted this. He's played it hundreds of times, Hikaru, but just deciding what mood he's in.
Yeah, it's a big day in the Champions Chess Tour. We have the very first grand final of the season, and we really, really want you guys to join in and hang out with us here in the studio. You can share your thoughts, your questions for our experts in the studio, either on Twitter using the hashtag ChessChamps or in the Twitch chat. We will pay attention to that as well. Thank you for being with us on this big day in the Champions Chess Tour, and let's have some fun.
I feel like we've said our favorite Pokemon. Magnus and Carl did the same. The chat probably has to get involved with that as well. I mean, we're talking about chess, but Pokemon has been a theme throughout the event.
Definitely.
And Kaya, you were saying let's have some fun. Take a look at the position on the board. David, we were looking at lines where the bishop can develop, but Hikaru chooses none of that. He goes for the most dynamic option of picking up that central pawn, sacrificing that B pawn. This is a mess on the board. What is going on?
Yeah, so this is a known variation, but I haven't known Hikaru to dabble in this one too much. Normally he chooses a very solid approach. There we see Magnus push a pawn forward. So the Queen's Gambit accepted. It's a kind of branch of that now. Showed Hikaru grabbing a pawn. He's given a pawn back, but not the typical pawn that you would see Black offer in most variations. Here, Black has really ugly structure on the queen side, doubled C pawns, isolated A pawn, but he has a really juicy outpost for his knight in the middle of the board. And whoever races out, gets developed first, tends to get the advantage here. I've always slightly preferred White's chances. You get more space, you have the more fluid structure, but Black, as Tanya said, very dynamic, and Hikaru clearly choosing this opening because of the match situation. It's part of his strategy to imbalance things and maybe even go for a win as Black. Robert, what do you think of this plan?
I've always been a fan of this opening because it is so dynamic. Black has these doubled isolated pawns on the C file. We see the one next to the queen and the one sticking out pretty far on the C4 square. That said, as David was mentioning, the D5 square is firmly under Black's control. There's not a white pawn that can challenge the square, and Black's light square bishop will slide onto the fianchetto diagonal and take control over the board's longest line. So this is going to be good news for Hikaru. He can castle queenside. His king will be safe there despite the advanced pawns. And that D4 pawn is a bit tender in White's position. All that being said, the double isolated C pawns remain weaknesses. Sometimes they get picked off, and that could spell some trouble for Hikaru. So it's a double-edged position, chances for both.
Yep, definitely chances for both. But if this one does start to turn around, Hikaru's turning things in his favor, then Magnus might start to get nervous. A loss with White and the whole momentum, the whole initiative of the match would change. So Magnus here just developing his queen, both sides staying very, very flexible. Hikaru here, if he wants to keep Magnus guessing, might develop his bishop and say, okay, I might go this way, I might go the other way, depending on what you do. But as Robert says, it is very typical in this type of position to commit to going long towards the queen side. And it's surprisingly hard to attack Black's king on that flank. These Black knights act as fantastic guardians of that king. And if they protect it, then it's going to be very hard for Magnus to find a plan quite often. Really interesting start to this game.
I'm loving it. This is what we came for, and we're getting action from the word go. As we've been talking just how dynamic this position is, David, we don't know which side Hikaru wants to put his king on. Will it be on the king side or the queen side? Either way, there's going to be danger. White can also look at certain pawn breaks on the queen side with moving that B pawn one step ahead, and Magnus stops it forever with his Hikaru stops it forever with his last move. He jumps the knight forward. The one weakness that White had created with that A push is the B3 square. That is where the knight has headed. We've been talking about not making intentions clear with the Black king, and look at Hikaru's last move. There is no queenside castling anymore. Hikaru is going for the attack, for the initiative along the B file.
Yep, later on he'll clear some pieces out the way, and then a big target on the B2 square, backward pawn, long term. So this does mean that both sides maybe intend to castle on the king side, and we'll see if either side can attack on that flank later.
And you were mentioning about clearing the way. One possible plan for black to do that is step up with the bishop, do that c6 square, David, and then you want to bring your knight. Let's see if we can bring up the analysis board in a bit, but it's a very nice idea with that last move, making sure that you can attack the b2 pawn. The knight from b6 then can jump up to a4, offering some trades, taking away the pieces from white's queen side, and the play will be about flank attacks.
Yeah, flank attacks, and this pawn would be under watchful gaze here, and also, as Tanya mentions, this would be a nasty skewer if this does happen. So Hikaru's plan, what's he going to go for? Is he just going to move his bishop out the way and castle, safety first approach, or will he go a bit more aggressive and start landing blows already on that side of the board? Really interesting start, and yeah, did you expect this, Robert? I must admit, I thought Hikaru would just try and hold with black and press with white, but he hasn't been pressing hard with white so far this tournament, and wow, I think we're both shocked by this last move.
Yeah, you asked me about expectations. I wasn't quite expecting the pawn push. It does make sense. You're just saying, are you sure you want to castle kingside for Hikaru? Because if you castle there, white is going to launch an attack. Your initial question, did I expect this opening? Absolutely not. I expected the type of opening, though, because Hikaru Nakamura has said this in the past, and so many other players have as well, that a lot of people are afraid of Magnus Carlsen, and that helps him win games, that psychological edge. Hikaru is not afraid. He knows how good Magnus is. We saw their head-to-head record. Hikaru has lost maybe more games than anybody to Magnus Carlsen, but he's also beaten him perhaps more times than anybody else has. So he is ready to bring the fight to Magnus, and he plays Tanya's move, bishop c6. The knight may slide out next, as we were showing in some previous lines, but perhaps Magnus Carlsen is going to take a page out of, was it Gukesh's book? Sliding his king one square over. Instead of castling, he will lift his rook later, but for now, he might just slide his king to the side.
Yeah, and talking of Gukesh, I've seen Gukesh play this idea of pushing the pawn forward in this exact opening, this exact structure, multiple times. But also your point, Robert, who beats Magnus Carlsen once, let alone 51 times? And that's just Rapid and Blitz chess. And that's just official tournaments. They've played plenty, of course, online and kind of friendly matches as well. So, yeah, imagine beating Magnus 51 times and still having a losing record. Wow. Incredible stats.
You know, I think in sporting history, we've always got these epic matchups and these great rivalries that go down in history books. So if we think about boxing, there's Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier and their big fights. More recent history, there is Federer versus Nadal and their battles on court. And when we think about speed chess, today and in the future, when we will talk about speed chess, these are the two names that will come to our mind. Their fights, it will be Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's like Messi and Ronaldo after their picture recently, where they literally acted as these two with that position across the board from one of their epic battles, I think in Norway chess a few years back. I can't remember who was Messi, who was Ronaldo, but either way, two greats, two goats.
Magnus was, Ronaldo picked the Magnus position, and Messi had the Hikaru position. So how lucky Ronaldo and Messi are to get to be Magnus and Hikaru.
That's one way of putting it, for sure. But no, this position, it really is a messy one. And
I'm going to give you it's very nice.
But it is the type of position that Hikaru wants against Magnus. We saw in their first matchup in the winners' final that Magnus was getting these slight pulls. Hikaru's position was not very dynamic. He had to sit and wait for what Magnus was trying to accomplish. And here, Hikaru says, none of that. Magnus, you had the day off yesterday. Perhaps you weren't looking at chess, and I was. He prepared this line, and look at Magnus. He's saying, all steam ahead. Let's go. Push that pawn forward. H5, maybe that pawn will go forward even further to H6. Just try to create a dent in Black's king-side structure. All that said, Black's play is very quick with this knight A4 jump. The B2 pawn is already under attack. So Magnus has his work cut out for him.
Yeah, and he needs a solution to this move. This is clearly part of Hikaru Nakamura's plan right now to launch an attack on the queen side. And I'm not seeing it immediately, I've got to admit, how we comfortably defend this pawn. I don't really want to, for example, drop the bishop back to defend it. That would make a very sad piece of the white bishop. And if not, then Black has a serious threat. Rook takes pawn. Remember, as Tanya pointed out, knight takes knight is not really feasible unless you want to sacrifice material. Knowing Magnus, he would be okay with sacrificing. I've seen him sacrifice far more for far less in return. But yeah, right now it's so dynamic. So many tactics already in the player's mind, and we're only at move 15. They've played fast up to this point, but they're going to go into the tank for longer because it is so messy, so chaotic right now.
As sad as it might seem, I think, David, you just cannot drop that B2 pawn, so we might see a retreat with that bishop that you were pointing out. And we do see an attack on both sides. The queen side is where Hikaru's got his forces. The king side is where Magnus is trying to rush down with that H pawn. So a really incredibly dynamic position. And very often with these top players in chess, we see that their moves make sense when we look at them backwards. The plan that Hikaru's shown on the queen side, and we were talking about the knight jumping onto A4 to clear the B file, but Hikaru has something else in mind. He decides to force a trade-off and create an imbalance by exchanging the bishop for the knight.
Wow, interesting decision. I'm very biased towards my bishop, so that wasn't even on my radar at all. These top players, they know when to make exceptions, when to kind of forget their prejudices. And yeah, now this queen trade, what do we think? Should we have a vote? Are the queens coming off?
White can't go for a queen trade, because let's take a look at this. If you do go for the queen trade, the knight picks it up, and now the B2 pawn is just super vulnerable, David. This would be bad news for white, because notice how the rook and the knight, 2 attackers, currently 0 defenders, you might just end up being a pawn down in this endgame.
Yeah, and therefore we're assuming Magnus to dodge the queen trade. I'm just wondering how, because there are downsides, there are drawbacks to every square you want to put this queen on. If you move it, for example, 1 square forward, you might get hit by a knight. If you slide to the side, you might get hit by the other knight. Ideally, you want to use the central square, but then you're abandoning the whole of your queen side to their fate, and these pawns will drop off. Maybe you can go on an attack, switch focus to the other flank, but committal decision now for Magnus.
But a very Magnus move would be to trade queens, not by capturing. We keep talking about this. Kai, you've asked the question, and so has the chat. When do you trade pieces? You do it on your own terms. So the rook can slide over 1 square and say, let's trade on C2. That looks a lot better, because if the queens come off the board, now that pawn on C4 is under direct attack. Black can't just focus all of his forces on the B2 pawn, because both the knights are needed to defend this pawn on C4. I actually think this would be an advantageous position for Magnus, so I don't think Hikaru really wants to trade the queens. He would only do it under favorable circumstances, and that would be landing his pieces very quickly up the queen side.
Yeah. Okay. That's important in chess. Everything on your own terms. You know what your opponent wants, you know what you want, but you have to make sure that it's only in circumstances that favour you. And Magnus going into the tank, thinking now about level time.
If Magnus did take the black queen right now, would Hikaru then take back with the black knight and have both his knights on the rim? Wouldn't that be kind of bad for Hikaru?
I think in general it's not a great idea, but right there, just specifically and concretely, it's because white's B2 pawn would drop off. There's no way to save it, as Tanya was pointing out. So you're right, Kaya. Normally, you want to strand your opponent's knights on the side of the board, especially when you have strong bishops, as white does. But Robert predicts it correctly. You can allow a queen trade, but on your own terms. There, the black knights would have actually been surprisingly strong.
We've got this move that Robert was suggesting, and my heart's beating really fast because, guys, what happens if the black knight jumps onto B3? You got to move that rook away. The knight falls back, the rook comes back, the knight comes forward. We might see a little dance. Do you think there is a potential for a repetition here?
Oh, wow. We've predicted it before. We've got 2 prophets here in the studio, Tanya and Robert, and the knight has jumped in, hitting this rook. If the rook moves, black does have the opportunity to slide back. Second time we've seen this, and as Tanya's also mentioning, the rook moves, the knight moves.
Knight B3 on the board, David.
But the rook slid the other direction. So Magnus is saying, let me just shore up my weakest point. That pawn on B2 is exactly what black is going after. And now if the knight retreats, the queen can, in fact, dart to the center of the board and over to the king side, because you protected your weakness. The rook looked more active on D1, but this is a position that calls for defense, then switching into offensive gear. I like what Magnus is doing here. And you could sense by Hikaru's time management, he's starting to think, and his hands on his head. He knows that this is a big moment, and he can't just go back and forth, because Magnus is not going to repeat.
Yeah, really nice move there, and not intuitive at all. But again, that's why the top players are so good. They're happy to play passive moves if they really need to. They know when to be flexible, when to go on the attack, when to be active, when to sacrifice, but also when to take a timeout to just hold everything together. And I saw Hikaru on Twitter. He called it Groundhog Day, playing Magnus yet again. Do you think he fully believes in his chances today? I just love how brave he's been in this opening.
100%. I mean, just the way he's been playing, he knows what he needs to do to win this match. He needs to beat Magnus not once, but twice. And while it's a start, the kind of position that he's gotten, extremely dynamic. Now, he gives a check. He gives a check, doesn't fall back with the knight. And look at the way he's playing, such aggressive moves. Every move is a piece forward. Just incredible stuff. Hikaru knows that level 1 today is to first create chances in the first set, not to think about that final reset that he will get. And I think he's done everything right with the black pieces. It's not easy to get this kind of a position against Magnus Carlsen.
Yeah, it's a cliche, right? You take it game by game, move by move, but that's what Hikaru has to do. He is taking significant risks, however. He's playing very aggressively, but he has abandoned his king side, and Magnus takes the opportunity to step forward. Now, watch out. In any endgame, that white H pawn is very close to promotion. The number of times I've seen Magnus promote his A or H pawns after marching them forward this far, and only now does Magnus clarify the central tension. He trades off a pawn. Also, the black king wants to castle at some point. It can't stay in the center forever. It blocks the connection between the two rooks. So when Hikaru eventually does castle to the king side, his king will always have mating threats against it with this structure.
But what about Magnus? What is his plan with his king?
His king is going to have to stay put for a little bit, but that c4 pawn, that's the tender one. Black got rid of one of his double isolated pawns, and he might lose both. He traded off the one that was less advanced. Now the one that was sticking out might just fall. So I think Magnus, he's not thrilled about his king's placement, but there aren't black forces aiming at it, right? The king has so many of those minor pieces keeping it safe and sound. So the c4 pawn, I believe, is going to drop next. Maybe it's pre-movable at this point.
Yeah, it's almost pre-movable unless your opponent plays a really surprising move and attacks your queen or something. But yeah, Robert, so no matter how black recaptures this pawn, he's temporarily down a pawn. We're expecting him to take this one back. If he takes with the bishop or with the knight, the two most logical moves, you're expecting this pawn to suddenly drop off. So let's say knight takes pawn, white recaptures, and not only have you won a pawn, suddenly threats on the board. Actually, you're right. Maybe it is that simple right now. Do you think Hikaru's just misjudged something here, miscalculated? Or is there a way to justify going down a pawn now?
When someone offers a trade, and then after that piece is taken, they start thinking, it feels like they might have misevaluated the sequence of events. So Hikaru is probably trying to figure out how to deal with this, because if we just go down this line for a second, yes, the pawn structure will probably be compromised after knight takes bishop, queen takes knight, and then bishop takes e3 here. But there are all sorts of threats. The queen can go up to c6 with check, preventing black from castling. That king is actually getting hunted right away. If the king slides over, the queen just goes to d6 with check and hits the rook, winning the game on the spot. Maybe this is what Hikaru overlooked, because otherwise he would have a reasonable position, but the queen delivers that fatal check, and the rook will be hanging at the end of the day.
Yeah, you're right, Robert. Maybe he just assumed that Magnus had to recapture this bishop. Now the black king gets time to run to safety, and white is left with ruinous pawn structure, especially these two weak long term. I do slightly prefer white here, but at least black has a decent share of the chances. Okay, he's gone for this line, so we might well see after bishop takes pawn, Magnus just recapture, just go a pawn up and threats against the black king. Looking very, very shaky for Hikaru right now, down 2.5 minutes as well. Let's see whether he finds a solution. Magnus didn't take that pawn yet. Surprising, I've got to say, but still looks like a decent position. He trades off bishops instead, and there we go. He beat me to it. I was about to say, normally having an uncastled king is a problem because your rooks aren't connected, but here it doesn't matter. White's rook is able to get up the board and start attacking across, and very effective.
And there's a sick tactic here. Like, let's bring up an analysis board, because if black tries to defend this pawn on c4, it's under attack 3 times, you want to bring a piece to defend it. You bring your knight back to a5. White pushes this pawn up to b4. Normally, you could take en passant. It is a legal move, but you'll notice that the pawn is the only thing blocking the queens from staring at each other. So if you take en passant here, you actually lose your queen on c5. And if you don't take that pawn en passant, you're losing a knight because there is a fork. So the rook h4 is especially clever. Just going right after the c4 pawn, black's knight is unable to retreat. That spells trouble for Hikaru Nakamura. He is going to go down a pawn in this position.
Yeah, really sneaky, and the only other way to defend it is to shuffle your rook across, and here, I guess, as Magnus Carlsen, you can just take this pawn anyway. So the tactics are twofold there, and after the knight recaptures the bishop, now you take the other knight, and you've got a pawn ahead. Maybe this is damage limitation. This is what Hikaru needs to do. At some point, try to get your king castled, but suddenly the tactics all working out in white's favor, and that's a red flag. That's a bad sign. When all of these 2-3 movers are working in your opponent's favor, you need to start panicking. You need to start just trying to control things.
All right, well, remember everyone, we do have a competition for everyone today. If we end up with Armageddon, what do you think will be the winning bid? You can tweet your answer using the hashtag ChessChamps, and the one who gets closest will win a signed Airthings device signed by Magnus Carlsen. Our experts in the studio have also placed their bid. I have them safely in my envelope.
Did you place a bid, by the way?
I didn't place a bid.
So you can't be wrong.
So sneaky.
Nope. I like it that way. Just having your fate in my envelope. Yes.
Currently, it looks like it's Hikaru's fate, right? Because this position, we've been praising his opening approach and just what a mess he created. But now it just looks like it's somewhat backfired a little bit because he's down on the clock by almost 5 minutes already, barely out of the opening, which means that the biggest questions are still to come and still to be answered. The c4 pawn under fire, as we can see, the queen, the bishop, and the rook, all three pieces hitting it. And very importantly, black cannot just shift the rook, defend it, because regardless of that, perhaps we can just really quickly show this line that you were pointing out, David, where if black defends it with the third piece, and I see that Hikaru is reaching out for his mouse, he's about to make a move, then white can pick up the c4 pawn with the bishop, you pick it up with the knight, and the knight on b3 hangs. So he would have lost the pawn anyway, and instead Hikaru decides to first bring his king to safety. But the big question always in these positions is, how safe is that king? Look at that pawn on h6. Imagine at some point white's queen lands on f6. Once it gets there, the queen on f6, these dark squares that are super weak, there will be a mate on g7 that you'll have to watch out for the rest of the game. Black needs to be extremely careful. White picked up the pawn. Hikaru has gone to move that rook, pinning the bishop. But can the knight be picked up on b3?
I think it can, and it most likely will. And the only question here for Magnus is, which way do you capture? You could take this knight with your queen, allowing the black knight to jump in, and this is a superior version of what we looked at earlier for black, because suddenly both your rooks are active. Suddenly all of your pieces really, really well placed. And, okay, looks like we've gone in the other direction. Sorry, just to backtrack. After bishop takes, I was expecting queen takes queen here, I've got to say, and heading into an endgame. But white would have had an extra pawn. Instead, Hikaru gives a really sneaky check, hitting the white king. Just in time, Magnus is able to go and block with his queen. His queen was also under fire, and now the bishop falls. And this is the current position. White's still a pawn up.
Yeah, I think we were expecting that queen trade because of the activity black would have received. But the problem with black's position is this pawn on h6. It's not just trying to deliver a checkmate right now. Even without queens on the board, we could see a future where there's back-rank checkmate threats, and that's bad news for Hikaru's king. And that is probably why Hikaru said, I need more pieces on the board. But with those pieces on the board, and we just see Magnus's rook slide across to b4, hitting the queen, protecting that extra pawn. I mean, that pawn is ultra well defended. And now Magnus continues to improve his other pieces. Watch out for Hikaru's king, but for now he is quite active, trying to create threats against the white queen side.
Yeah, I'm expecting just to block this open file, as you mentioned, some threats later on of getting the rook behind. So block this open file, place your knight on a really nice square. And, for example, if we do see a rook trade, at least you have an active rook here, threatening this pawn in conjunction with your queen. You have a very well-placed knight. And for now, it looks like you've got an element of control. Still a pawn down, however, still maybe preference for white. But you're in the game.
And David, exactly this line, I think it demonstrates Robert's idea so well, that here black is hitting with the rook and the queen, the pawn on b2, but white doesn't need to bother with it. You can simply take the open C line for your rook. Always place your rook on open files. And now we see why that b2 pawn cannot be picked up, and the power of that h pawn on the other side of the board. You deliver a checkmate on the back rank.
Yeah, really nasty stuff. The tactics will continue. I mean, this type of thing is something that Hikaru have to worry about for the rest of the game. Let's go back to him. He's down to 2 minutes now. It's a 5-minute difference between the two players, and looking grim.
Is he in big trouble?
Big is an understatement. I think he's in huge trouble because, remember, against Magnus Carlsen in the winner's final, game one, Magnus won a pawn and had a great chance in the endgame, but he didn't have enough time, and Hikaru put pressure on Magnus's clock. Here, Magnus is ahead on the clock. He's up a pawn. His king is safer. I just feel like everything going right for Magnus Carlsen, he is surely going to take this game one. If he doesn't, he is going to be absolutely devastated.
Yeah, and Hikaru, against anyone else in the world, he would feel confident about his defensive chances. But here, clearly, the reason he's burning time on the clock is because he hates his position. And not only are you a pawn down, also checkmating ideas against your king. It's, yeah, multiple reasons.
And the clock, he's now down to almost just a minute, and Magnus has got over 7 minutes. That's a huge time advantage in a super difficult situation. We've often spoken about how one of the biggest strengths of Hikaru is his resilience, his resourcefulness. And he needs to show that now more than ever.
I just don't know what to do because we keep talking about this white pawn on h6, which is threatening. We talk about if a queen lands up in the attack, then white knight can also help out and go for the attack. We were quoting Taylor Swift yesterday. I mean, white horses, right? Land me a white horse on f6. That's bad news for the black king. So Hikaru lashes out with his pawn push to a5. Look at how quickly, though, Magnus is responding, and Hikaru needs to have his moves ready quickly because he's down under a minute on the clock, and he remains a pawn down on the board.
Amazing speed there by Magnus. It just feels like he's playing on all sides of the board, and now that knight can jump up to g5, also opening up the f line for the queen to land on to try and put pressure on the white side. He's playing on all sides of the board. Magnus has got this rook on b5, which takes control of the queen side, any activity against the b pawn, while the other rook and the queen and the knight, the arrows that you're drawing, David, exactly point out to the idea that queen from f3 will threaten that pawn, also threaten to jump onto f6 and that mate that we've been talking about on the g7 square. Big trouble here for black.
I've said it so many times, once the opponent's queen is this far distanced from her own king, you need to go on the attack. You need to target that enemy king while you have the opportunity here. It takes black's queen 3 or 4 moves minimum to get back to any potentially defensive square. And this looks like a devastating move, Tanya, the one you're mentioning, bringing the knight forward. And Magnus, I think, will go for that. I could also imagine a very Magnus type of move would be to just shuffle the king towards the corner, towards safety, just to avoid any potential checks long term. Black's queen could come back and annoy the king on this diagonal at some point. So just prophylaxis, as we say, just get the king to safety, and the tactic's still working in white's favor. But yeah, no matter what move he chooses right now, looking very promising for white. A good moment, I feel, for Magnus to stop and invest some time. Still 5 minutes up on the clock with a very, very strong position.
Remember, this is best out of 4 rapid games, and if Magnus wins the grand final match, he will be the winner of the Airthings Masters. Hikaru Nakamura, he has to win this match to get a second chance and take it to a grand final reset. And we are enjoying you guys watching this together with us. Look at that. Colin is actually watching this in class. Naughty, but we like it.
He's doing all the right things, Kaya.
Calculus, ugh. I agree.
I like calculus.
Was that your favorite subject?
No, but I liked it. I mean, call me a nerd. I'm a chess grandmaster, so I can't really hide it. But calculus was fun. So some people need calculus. It's a good subject.
I'll pick chess over calculus, David, any day of the week. Kaya, you were saying how Hikaru needs to win the match. Right now, he's thinking about how on earth does he save this position. And the more I look at it, the more hopeless it feels, David. And we've been discussing all these mating ideas, and Magnus steps up with his queen to the center of the board. I get the feeling that because of the mating nets that we've been showing, the black king just caged up on the king side, Hikaru might not have any better choice than to offer a queen trade, but the endgame is no better for him.
And you predicted it correctly, Tanya, and you're right, it's no better for him. Still just insurmountable problems, it feels like, with the black king on the back rank. Maybe if the black king was closer to the center again, an active king in the endgame, he would have some chances, but this one, I already see some trouble. There's some variations here, which I think will land on the board. Magnus is happy to just trade one set of rooks because that black rook is stuck. It has to defend passively the back rank, and now Magnus will start getting his pieces into the game, starting, I think, with rook lift.
Casey Bell in the Twitch chat saying Magnus has a bunch of winning moves. Is that the case, basically?
Yeah, it's hard to go wrong for Magnus because black is completely tied down. The rook for black will likely slide next to the king, and just going back to the castled position to defend this tender f7 pawn, because white's forces are just jumping forward and going to go for the attack. So Magnus knows he's winning. Hikaru also understands that Magnus should be winning. So for Hikaru, it's about just trying to create some sort of challenges, and that's what he's doing. He's going for the queenside pawns. B2 is going to be lost, and it's not about pawn quantity. I mean, that's not the only thing that matters. The piece quality is the more important element of this position. That's why Hikaru didn't even take the pawn. He understood that his knight would have actually been trapped on B2. You see, the knight has nowhere back to go. The rook has to stay in the last rank, otherwise there's a checkmate that gives white a free hand on the king side or in the center of the board just to trap that knight and go ahead and win at least a pawn and maybe more.
Yeah, and now, again, Magnus has that luxury of the move. Okay, he brings his rook to the 7th rank, as Robert points out. This pawn is the first target. It's going to be the first one that drops. At some point, Magnus will happily just activate his king. The knight will always be trapped if it ever gets greedy. And, wow, Hikaru decides to go for it. I think there were no better options. This knight now stuck in no man's land. And even if you don't trap it, just go on the attack. There we go, Magnus Carlsen tying down. Look how passive these pieces are. Now he can reroute his knight into this juicy f6 square, and the king is going to be stuck in the corner as a bystander for the rest of the game. Looking winning now for white, despite the fact it is level material. And yeah, Magnus, how smoothly is he going to try and convert this one?
He's still got some threats that he needs to take care of. Hikaru does have some tricks up his sleeve. We see the position that we have as you were analyzing. You called it out, David. He's moved the rook back. It looks really passive, but he has a trick of jumping back with the knight. And you bring it back into the game, you hit both pawns, the a3 pawn and the central pawn. All these activity, these mating ideas that we're discussing for Magnus right now really rely on that e5 pawn, which is why we see Magnus's last move. He comes back with the rook to take away that key square for the knight, and Hikaru shifting back to the open file, again threatening the knight jump from b2 to c4.
Okay, some tricks, at least some hope of salvation if you get your knight back into the game. I'm wondering now how Magnus proceeds. You're right, Tanya, actually. Not as easy as it looks at first glance. Still feels like it must be winning somehow, but some work to be done.
Yeah, I feel like if the A-pawns are traded, that may allow Hikaru to breathe a slight sigh of relief. But the problem is that black will still be passively tied down to the defense, and at some point, white will be able to crash through with pawn pushes on the king side. So if the G-pawn goes up and the F-pawn goes up 2 squares, with a rook on the 7th rank, there will be devastation for the black king. So it's not ideal to trade off the A-pawns. Of course, Magnus wanted to win the A4 pawn for free, and he may be able to do just that. But even if those pawns are traded, I still think he has great winning chances because black can hardly move.
Yep, he's so slippery, Hikaru. I've seen him defend so many bad positions over the course of his career. It's probably what he's best at, as he mentioned yesterday in the interview himself. But here, Magnus, it's going to feel like a huge missed opportunity if he doesn't convert it. And now, suddenly only 1 minute difference.
Yeah.
Suddenly things not so easy. Magnus maybe doubting himself for the first time this game. Hikaru doing a great job of defending. We have to praise his defensive skills. Yes, the evaluation bar says it's dead lost, but he's causing some practical problems. He's not making it straightforward. The winning moves are likely less obvious now for a human.
100%. Hikaru's resilience is from another universe, is what it feels like. And Magnus is thinking more and more. He's got about a minute on his clock. Hikaru, 30 seconds. This is not going to be as easy as we thought, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, look at Hikaru's face. He is determined, and I believe the moves are going to happen fast because this pawn on f7 is what Magnus will have to go for, and Hikaru, see, rook f4, here come the moves. Here they are all going, and the white king goes up. Well, look at Hikaru go. He's just chasing the king around, trying to force it to a suboptimal square, but the f7 pawn, at the end of the day, that still remains a target, and Hikaru down to just 11 seconds.
When only 3 seconds increment, remember. It's getting dramatic already in game 1.
It's getting very dramatic, and it feels like Magnus's winning plan here is to just dodge the checks at any cost. Maybe drop your king back to d2, kick that black rook away, prevent the checks. Yes, you allow black to gobble up your queenside, but you're going for the black king. Just tunnel vision is all that's required right now. Go for that black king, and it should be the end. And he's going for it. Hikaru drops back. Very clever defensive move yet again. What a champion he is, holding on here for dear life.
Nihilistic in the Twitch chat saying Psyduck versus Hikaru.
I love it.
Applause. That is amazing.
And, OK, he's shifting focus now. White's rook threatening to deliver a nasty check, a mating threat there on the back rank, which Hikaru blocks yet again. It feels like Magnus is throwing everything at Hikaru, but Hikaru is always swatting it away. He always has an answer. And suddenly the black knight is threatening 2 pawns simultaneously. Magnus takes 1, but... OK, it does feel like Hikaru's slightly closer to saving this game now, especially if he can go and capture that white H-pawn, that thorn in his side.
And it's heading there. That's exactly what he does. He moves that knight, attacking that H-pawn, but you can pick up the F7 pawn currently. Because if you pick it up with the knight, then you don't win that h6 pawn. So white does have that option. Magnus goes for it, picking up a pawn, defending his own, and I'm expecting Hikaru to move the rook along the f-file. And what happened?
No, this
1
game is still
second.
going. Yeah, he still had enough time, but barely enough time. And that's the problem, is the knight is kicked out. So the white knight defends the pawn. The black knight can't stay there forever. And don't forget that white has this passed pawn on the queen side. That a3 pawn still exists. You're going to start pushing that one up the board and threatening the black king with checkmating ideas.
Hikaru looks very unhappy with his position, shaking his head there.
He looked ready to resign. He nearly got out of his chair a moment ago. Now, Magnus has to be slightly careful where he puts the king. You don't want to put the king on a passive square. There we go. Out into the open, out towards safety. And I think Hikaru, body language, he's ready to resign. The white king's just going to attack these pieces. And now the black king is the one that is doomed. Checkmate is coming. Black's king all alone. And Hikaru does eventually throw in the towel.